If there is a hell, that will be where Ian Brady is going to go.
Brady and Hindley and the Moor's murder killings, one of the landmark cases of the 20th century.
No serial killer has really impacted on the popular imagination like this one.
In the 1960s, 4 children were brutally murdered and buried on Saddleworth Moor, near Manchester. It was the murder of a 5th victim that brought the killers to the attention of the police. What sickened the nation was that those responsible were a young couple, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. It was the first known case in British criminal history where a woman had been involved in the serial sex killing of children. But what drove this couple to such depths of depravity, and why is this case still so relevant today? I'm Fred Dinenage, and I'm investigating some of the country's most infamous murderers. I want to know what turned them into killers, sentencing themselves to death or a lifetime behind bars. I also want to know what kind of impact a crime like the Moor's murders has, not only on the immediate community, but on the nation as a whole.
The names Ian Brady and Myra Hindley still make headline news today. They took 5 innocent lives and created a legacy of fear. But where did it all start? Ian Brady was born Ian Duncan Stewart in 1938 in a Glasgow slum to single mother Peggy Stewart. Unable to cope, Peggy gave the baby up for adoption to a local couple.
What makes a serial killer? Does their childhood have an impact on the crimes they commit as an adult? Author Jean Ritchie has spent a number of years studying the Moor's murders, re-examining the notorious couple.
Well, he was born illegitimate, which was quite a stigma at that time. His mother was a waitress and he never knew who his father was. And his mother struggled to keep him for a little while in a tenement in Glasgow. But when she failed to be able to do that and work, she actually fostered him out in an unofficial sort of fostering arrangement with a rather nice family called the Sloanes, who actually brought him up.
Brady was a lonely, difficult child and prone to frequent temper tantrums. He rarely applied himself at Shawlands Academy. He was considered lazy, secretive, and an outsider by the other children.
He was a clever boy. He passed to go to an academic, well, what in England would be called a grammar school, but in Scotland it was an academy. So he was quite a clever boy, but he didn't really capitalise on that. And by the time he was 13, he had his first court appearance for housebreaking. And that started a stream of petty thefts and petty criminal activities.
In the early years, Peggy visited her son frequently at the Sloanes. But then when Brady was 12, his mother, Peggy, married an Irish labourer, Patrick Brady, and moved to Manchester, leaving her son behind.
In 1953, 16-year-old Brady was again arrested and sent by the court to Manchester to live with his mother for a fresh start. He changed his identity from Ian Stewart and took his stepfather's name, becoming Ian Brady. But this didn't curb his life of crime. He was sent to Borstal for another 2 years after stealing lead seals from boxes. And this encouraged a growing fascination with Nazism. Leading criminologist Professor David Wilson knows all too well the signs of a troubled mind.
I think Brady's fascination with Nazism works on a number of different levels. Firstly, there's this sense in which Hitler obviously was the father to the masses, and Brady is without a father. Remember, too, that Brady is somebody who has consistently liked to shock. It's a shocking thing to like the Nazis when you're born in 1938 and you've lived through the war, and you're having to deal with post-war austerity. To say you support the people that you've actually been fighting against is quite a shocking thing to do.
By November 1957, Brady was free again. And 2 years later, when he was 21, he got a job as a clerk in a local company.
Millward's merchandising is going to become central to the Brady story because it's there that he meets a typist by the name of Myra Hindley. Myra Hindley, 4 years younger than Brady, born in 1942. Her father was away fighting the Second World War, and indeed we see in Myra's childhood very powerful female influences, particularly her mother and especially her grandmother.
Catholic priest Father Tida was Myra Hindley's prison chaplain for the last 5 years of her life. She often talked about her childhood to him.
She didn't have an easy childhood. She grew up in quite a poor, rough area. Her father was a drinker. When she was quite young, she was sent to live with her grandmother, and she had a very close relationship with her grandmother. She loved her dearly.
Hindley's youth became a search for adventure and mystery. She started dyeing her hair peroxide blonde and wearing dark makeup.
Myra Hindley's first meeting with Ian Brady brought instant infatuation. She told her girlfriends excitedly about the young 22-year-old Brady, his soft Glaswegian accent, his dark wavy hair, oiled and combed. He reminded her of Elvis or James Dean.
She was actually engaged to another boy, young man, but she fell instantly in love with Ian Brady. His strangeness fascinated her. She once said that he was the only man she'd ever met who had clean fingernails.
And he introduced her to all sorts of things that she had not had in her life. He introduced her to classical music and to literature, J.H. Lawrence and those sorts of people. And he was an interesting man. And so now we would say that he groomed her. And I think that's what he did.
Brady fulfilled some of the fantasy that Myra Hindley must have had in relation to having a life less ordinary.
Brady was a keen photographer and would take Hindley to Saddleworth Moor on his motorbike, 13 miles outside Manchester. She allowed him to take pornographic photographs of her and accepted Brady's ideas as they became even more outrageous. In 1963, Brady asked Hindley to help him with a bank robbery.
This is almost classic grooming techniques, and Brady would test her periodically about how far that grooming had gone. So, for example, Brady rode a motorbike but didn't have a driving license. So he would encourage Myra to pass her driving test so that he could be driven around by her. He had this fantasy that they were going to commit a bank robbery. So, of course, he's going to say, Myra, you're going to drive the getaway car. So she starts to practice how to drive away from a supposed bank robbery. This is a way of testing the loyalty of the particular person that Brady is creating.
Myra had fallen under Ian Brady's spell, but how far would her loyalty be tested? On the 12th of July 1963, 16-year-old Pauline Reed disappeared. Had the young couple taken their relationship a step too far?
He had it that he wanted to commit a perfect crime, and for quite a long time she believed that was going to be a bank robbery or a post office robbery. And then he started talking about the perfect murder, so he sort of brought her into it step by step.
From planning bank robberies, Brady went on to talk about committing the perfect murder, and he wanted his co-conspirator to help him put the plan into action. Myra Hindley drove a small van she'd borrowed from the local greengrocer. Brady followed on his motorbike, flashing his lights when he saw a potential victim. The first real possibility was Pauline Reed, who Hindley recognised from living a few streets away. Former Detective Chief Superintendent Jeff Knupfer has studied the case in depth.
They were taken off the street, these children. They were selected by Brady predominantly. He would point them out, and Hindley would then negotiate the abduction, if you want, using various ploys such as, will you come and help us move some boxes? In terms of Pauline Reed, it transpired that when they pulled up at the side of Pauline Reed, who was walking along the street, Hindley immediately recognised her because she was a neighbour. So she stopped, chatted to her, and asked if she would come and help her look for a glove. And she accompanied Hindley up to Saddleworth Moor in a vehicle, and Brady drove behind on a motorbike.
Whilst Hindley and Brady's accounts of the events leading up to Pauline's murder match, their descriptions of Myra Hindley's role in her death do not. Hindley's role, according to alleged statements from Brady, was active, in which he physically and sexually assaulted the girl with him.
According to Hindley, what then happens is that Brady goes with Pauline Reed to look for the glove, leaving Hindley in the van. We now know that what happened was that Pauline Reed was sexually assaulted by Ian Brady, and then he cut her throat. But the planning of that murder is something that we shouldn't ignore. So, for example, Brady has already left a spade that can be used to dig the grave that he's going to put Pauline's body into. And both Brady and Hindley drive back to their house, where he will cut up his clothes, burn his clothes so as to destroy any evidence, wash the spade that he's used to dig the grave that Pauline's body has gone into, and even with the knife, wash the knife of any evidence and then throw it away.
The search proved futile. The police had no witnesses and no clues as to the whereabouts of Pauline Reed. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley had got away with murder. I'm Fred Dinenage, and I'm investigating the infamous Moors murderers, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley.
On July the 12th, 1963, 16-year-old Pauline Reed was picked up from the street by the pair and driven to Saddleworth Moor, where she was brutally murdered and her body buried.
All the killings are very sad, but the idea of this young 16-year-old being allowed by her very loving mum and dad to go to a dance for the first time on her own that night, and buying a new pair of white stilettos to go in, being picked up by these two, taken up to the moors, murdered, buried, and then many years later those white stilettos were found, and inside them you could still see the gold writing of the manufacturer because they were so new. That's heartbreaking.
Brady and Hindley had gone from planning bank robberies to committing a real-life murder. Brady has never explained what led him to this point. According to Hindley, during interviews in later life, she claimed she did it because she was scared of him.
Any regrets after that, do you think?
She said she didn't know he was actually going to kill Pauline Reed. She didn't know he would go through with it, and that she did think at one point that she would go, while he went away with Pauline, she would drive down and go to the police. But you know, one is left with the fact that after that, possibly she didn't know he was going to kill Pauline, but after he has killed Pauline, she could have stopped the whole thing there and then. She could have gone to the police at that point. She then knew he was actually carrying out these threats to murder. So
Pauline Reed had been missing for just 4 months. Then on Saturday, November the 23rd, another child disappeared. 12-year-old John Kilbride.
Their first target was a 16-year-old pubescent girl. Their second target is 12-year-old John Kilbride. Now, it's quite clear again that we've got this very constructed behaviour, asking for help in relation to moving boxes or finding another lost glove, some kind of subterfuge that is again going to get John Kilbride into the van.
Hindley hired a 2-door white Ford Anglia, and the couple spent the day in Leek. They drove to Ashton Market at about 4 p.m. Hindley wore a black wig because Brady felt her blonde hair was too conspicuous. John Kilbride had been approached by a young couple at the market and climbed into the passenger seat next to the lady.
he was taken onto the moors by Brady, hit and then strangled. Again, we only have Myra Hindley's words for that, and of course she claims she did not witness the actual killing, but we do know that that's where he ended up.
According to Myra Hindley's version of events, Brady took 12-year-old John Kilbride onto the moors, where at first he tried to slit his throat and then strangle him with a piece of string until he died.
I mean, it's such a bleak place, Saddleworth Moor, isn't it? You can just imagine the terror of the
And at
children.
night, in the dark, you know, they picked him up late in the afternoon. They went like lambs to the slaughter, that was Myra's own words, because I think they, even right to the last minute, they probably thought these nice people were going to give them something, or they were looking for a glove or something. But the last few moments of their lives must have been horrific.
What's also interesting about the murder of John Kilbride from a criminological perspective is that they subsequently take photographs of Hindley on the grave where John Kilbride has been buried. And this is the first real example I can think of where trophies are taken. The photograph becomes a trophy, a way of reminding Brady and Hindley of what they have done.
When John did not return home for dinner, his parents called the police. A large search was conducted with police and volunteers combing the surrounding area. No sign was found.
Ian Brady and Myra Hindley had found their killing stride. With no clues to the murderers, they felt unstoppable. On the 16th of June 1964, 12-year-old Keith Bennett left his mother's house in Eston Street to walk to his grandmother's house in Morton Street. He never arrived.
Now, Keith was wandering along, and they pulled the car up alongside him, and again they chatted to him and persuaded him to get into the car, and that was it. They took him again up to the moors. Keith's mother assumed he'd gone to stay with his grandmother. He hadn't, so it wasn't until the next day the alarm was raised. But to be honest, it wouldn't have made any difference, because by then he was another body on the moors.
According to Hindley, after walking deep into the moors, Brady killed Keith by strangling him with a piece of string. He wasn't discovered missing until the next morning, when his grandmother and mother met up. The police were called. Once again, a search was conducted, and once again, no trace of the missing child was found.
3 children had gone missing without trace, and the police were no closer to finding them. In the meantime, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were like any other normal couple, working at Millward's merchandising and spending their spare time socialising. Their favourite hobby? Travelling to the moor, walking the dog, and Brady would take photographs of Myra. After the first 3 murders, for example, do you think Brady was beginning to regard himself as being invincible?
One of Brady's loves was Nietzsche. And Nietzsche, of course, is famous for writing about man and Superman. And here's Brady having committed 3 murders of 3 children in the local community and has not been caught. He must have thought of himself as being all-powerful, of being invincible. He's not just a man, he's Superman.
In September 1964, Hindley and her grandmother were allocated a new house, 16 Wardlebrook Avenue in Hattersley, a new council estate built to move the poor out of slum dwellings. Ian Brady also moved in, giving the pair the perfect opportunity to continue their murderous relationship. On the 26th of December 1964, 10-year-old Leslie Downey became the 4th victim.
This is a world I inhabit. You know, I have to work with serial murderers and deal with police investigations, but even for me, I find the murder of Leslie Downey to be particularly horrific and moving. Boxing Day 1964, she's gone to a fun fair with friends. The friends leave the fun fair. Leslie Ann stays on, and undoubtedly she encounters Brady and Hindley at the fun fair. There's a slight change in MO also with Leslie Ann Downey, because we can see in the murder of Leslie Ann Downey an escalation of serial killer behaviour. Whereas John Kilbride, Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett had been taken to the moors and murdered and then buried. Leslie Downey's going to be murdered in Wardlebrook Avenue in the most graphic and pornographic circumstances.
The pair took the 10-year-old girl back to the house Hindley shared with her grandmother, who was away at the time. There, Brady and Hindley tortured Leslie Ann until she died. It's believed she was also strangled.
Ian Brady had always been a keen photographer. He'd taken a lot of pornographic pictures of Myra Hindley, and he now took pornographic pictures of this little girl. And astonishingly, they tape recorded the whole experience. And I think this is the tape recording that damned Myra Hindley more than any other thing in the eyes of the public, because you can clearly hear her being extremely brusque and hard with this child, trying to make this child go into the positions that Ian wanted for these photographs. Little naked child who is pleading and calling her mum. Mum, please, I need to go home. I need to go home, Mum. No, don't make me do that, Mum. Mum, all the time to Myra Hindley. A poor little girl pleading for them not to do it. And then, of course, they murdered her. Ian murdered her. And they got her body up to the moors and buried her up there. The tape recording survived, and it is the most moving thing. The Christmas Carol, the little drummer boy, is on that tape as well. And any policeman who heard that tape said he could never hear that Christmas Carol ever again without switching the radio off or turning away with tears in his eyes, because that tape is such a moving thing. It's a child pleading for their life, really.
Leslie Ann Downey was buried on these grim moors along with Pauline Reed, John Kilbride and Keith Bennett. Once again, a child had gone missing. A police search was launched, but no trace of the 10-year-old girl's body was found.
Myra Hindley and Ian Brady seemed unstoppable, and they were about to recruit a new member to their dark ways. Myra's younger sister, Maureen, had married a local lad called David Smith. She was 18 at the time, and he 16. Maureen was pregnant with their first child.
He was very young and impressionable. I think Ian Brady thought he'd got another convert to his cult. And he spent a lot of time with David. They drove up to the moors and they talked, and he lent David Smith books. And again, David Smith, a bit like Myra, was impressed by this rather more educated, sophisticated person. And he and Brady were planning, or they were always planning a robbery. David Smith always had money problems, so he was happy to go along with that.
On the 25th of April 1965, Maureen and David Smith's 6-month-old daughter Angela died. This marked a turning point in Brady's relationship with David Smith. Smith was now a broken man. He was a poor and unemployed 17-year-old. He saw the bank robbery as a way out and joined in the planning. Little did he know that murder would be his initiation. I'm investigating the notorious child killers Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Between 1963 and 1964, the pair had brutally killed 4 children. Hindley's brother-in-law, David Smith, had been recruited by the pair to help with their next criminal endeavour.
In October 1965, Ian Brady and David Smith planned to rob the Electricity Board showroom, but a few days before, the plan changed. On October the 5th, Smith was ordered to bring any incriminating evidence to Brady, who then drove off with Myra. A day later, Edith Evans saw her 17-year-old son, Edward, for the last time.
Former Detective Chief Superintendent Ian Fairley recalls the 5th and oldest victim of Brady and Hindley.
He was a young 17-year-old apprentice for AEI at Trafford Park in Manchester. He came from I would describe as a very poor home, but yeah, he was a smartly dressed young man. I think it made mileage, shall we say, for Brady and Hindley to point towards the fact that he could possibly be homosexual. I won't say it's an excuse of what they did, but just really to put some blame on him as a character.
Ian picked him up, claimed later he picked him up for a homosexual encounter. There was never any evidence that Edward Evans was homosexual, and back in those days it was a crime actually, so it was not a good thing. But they took him home. He introduced the boy to Myra as his sister.
They took him back to Hindley's house. Her grandmother was upstairs, unaware of events taking place in her home. Brady was left in charge of Edward Evans at 16 Wardlebrook Avenue, while Hindley visited her sister and brother-in-law. She said that Brady had some alcoholic miniatures for David and suggested he return with her. Smith had no idea of what Brady had planned.
David Smith goes into Wardlebrook Avenue and he hears some high-pitched screams and Myra shouting, "Help him, Dave." So Smith goes into the room, the front room where Evans and Brady were, and he sees Edward Evans being attacked. Edward Evans is lying on the sofa and Brady is standing over him with an axe. Edward Evans is still alive at this point and is able to get under a table. Brady pulls him back from under that table and attacks him again, eventually having to put a cushion over his face and smother and strangle him. Brady, quote unquote, is reported to have said, "This was the bloodiest, the messiest yet."
Ian Brady and David Smith carried the body of Edward Evans to the spare room. Now, Brady had injured his ankle during the attack, so Smith said he'd come back the next day with a pram to carry the body to the car. Brady and Hindley agreed. Smith walked calmly away with no intention of ever coming back.
On the morning of the 7th of October 1965, David and Maureen Smith went to Hyde Police Station and told officers what had happened at 16 Wardlebrook Avenue and just how deadly Brady was.
David Smith, I always feel, was vilified. He was vilified by the people of Manchester, who refused to believe he hadn't been involved in other killings. People walked out of pubs if he came in, nobody would speak to him and that kind of thing. David Smith's a hero in my eyes because David Smith did what Myra should have done at the beginning.
The police arrived at 16 Wardlebrook Avenue with the lead detective, Superintendent Bob Talbot, dressed as a delivery man so as not to alert suspicion from Brady and Hindley.
The back door was answered by Myra Hindley, and he told us he was a policeman and pushed his way in, and we followed him into the house and found Brady.
What were your impressions of Brady?
He was, I suppose at the time, a little bit dishevelled. He had been knocked out of his bed, if you like, near Leslie Moor, and he was a bit shaken, if you like, but he was obviously intelligent. There was no question about that he was very controlled of what he was doing. The house was searched. We found upstairs the doors were locked, and one of the bedroom doors was locked. And Hindley's grandmother was in another bedroom. She said the key wasn't here, the key was in the office in Manchester. Mr. Talbot said to me, "You better take her to Manchester and get the key." As a young man, I said, "I'll kick the door in." Anyway, Brady said, "You better give him the keys." So Hindley gave him the keys, went upstairs, and in the bedroom we found the trussed-up body of Edward Evans. He was in a fetal position, tied up in a plastic bag.
The police had their man. Ian Brady was arrested and charged. But it would only be a matter of time before the police made a new discovery and uncovered the true horrors that awaited them on the moors.
The fact of the matter is, the police had assumed that Brady had committed this one murder and that was it.
Oh, this was very much the thing. At the time when we actually, in fact, arrested him, we had a body. He had admitted it. he had gone at great pains not to have Hindley involved in the attack or anything like that, that David Smith said that Brady had told him he had committed more. And also one of the things that Brady had said when Smith actually got to the scene, if you like, and that was his words were, "That's the messiest one yet," which also gives an indication that it could possibly be more.
During the police search of Brady's house, the discovery of a notebook would provide a new lead, and the true extent of Brady and Hindley's crimes would be discovered.
I think one of the things that came to light was a notebook in the house, just a children's exercise book almost, in which there were lots of silly scribblings and drawings and doodles the way people do, and a name of a few film stars, but the name John Kilbride was in there. And that sort of set alarm bells ringing. And David Smith had told them that this couple had been burying bodies of children on the moors. And, you know, suddenly there was the name of a child.
Myra Hindley was arrested on the 11th of October 1965, 4 days after Ian Brady's arrest. She was charged as an accessory to the murder of Edward Evans after a document was found in her car describing how the murder would be carried out. This was written in Ian Brady's shorthand. During a police interview, David Smith mentioned suitcases of incriminating items, as well as trips to Manchester Central Railway Station by Brady and Hindley.
And one of the things he did was, before the killings, he took all the pornographic material he got, pictures of Myra, pictures of Leslie Downey, the tape recording of Leslie Downey, and he took them all and put them in one of the Manchester stations in a left luggage office.
There was obviously audio tapes in them we could do nothing with, but photographs and books and all that stuff, but there was hundreds of photographs. And I found a photograph of a little girl, and she had a scarf tied round about her mouth, and she was naked. And that really was the Pandora's box, if you like.
One of the suitcases also contained an audio recording. In 1965, the police, with no way of playing it, took the reels to BBC Manchester.
There's a man's voice on it. The woman's voice eventually was identified as being Hindley. And the man's voice was Brady. We had a difficulty then because of the whose was a little girl. We suspected who it was, but who's going to tell us who the little girl's voice is? Difficult. There's only one person, and that was her mum. So we had to play the tape to her mum. Now, thinking about the tape makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I can feel them standing up the back of my neck now. But can you imagine the ordeal that was to play these tapes to her mum? Her mum was told what was on the tape, and it wasn't pleasant, but we needed to identify the voice if we were going to prosecute these people.
How did her mum react?
Oh, she was devastated. She was, completely, she was a broken woman. But she knew, she'd been told what was going to be on the tapes, but she was willing to do it, obviously, because, it was important to her.
On the 16th of October 1965, the body of 10-year-old Leslie Downey was discovered on Saddleworth Moor with the help of evidence collected by police. The search was now on for the missing child, John Kilbride. It was a photo of Myra Hindley holding a dog and looking beyond the dog at a pile of stones that led the way. On the 21st of October 1965, the badly decomposed body of the 12-year-old boy was uncovered nearly 2 years after he was killed.
On the 6th of May 1966, Ian Brady was found guilty of the murders of Leslie Downey, John Kilbride and Edward Evans. Myra Hindley was found guilty of the murders of Leslie Downey and Edward Evans. She was also found guilty of harbouring Brady in the knowledge that he'd killed John Kilbride. Both were sentenced to life, but the bodies of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett were still missing.
I'm Fred Dinenage, and I'm re-examining the horrific crimes of the Moor's murderers, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. The now famous Moor's murderers had both been sentenced to life in prison. The public reacted with outrage at their crimes and disbelief in the role Myra Hindley played. Surely a woman couldn't commit acts of such brutality.
What sort of public hysteria and media hysteria was there at the time?
Oh, massive, massive, massive. First of all, it was deaths of children, but most of all, and the thing that has made this case go into posterity probably, is that it was a woman killer, and a woman killing children. It was against everybody's idea about a woman. I mean, since then we've had Rosemary West, we've had one or two others, but everybody's idea was that women were nurturing, and they weren't killers anyway, and that still remains true today. They don't murder as much as men do. But women particularly did not murder children and were not cruel to children, and this case had that dimension.
It's interesting how to gauge how Myra reacted to the murders, because if you listen to her confessions, in inverted commas, from the mid-1980s, she was always somewhere else when the murder took place. She was always just round the corner, wasn't she? But if you think about the progression in those murders, the first three took place on the moors, but the murder of both Leslie Downey and Edward Evans took place in Myra's house. So the progression, her desire to distance herself initially, seems to me not to tie in with what we know criminologically about how the murder of Leslie Downey took place and in relation to the murder of Edward Evans. And let's also be clear, we have evidence of Myra Hindley's participation in the murder of Leslie Downey, because the tape exists of Myra Hindley being centrally involved in that particular murder.
The digging of the moors continued, but the police were unable to find any further bodies. In prison, Hindley remained under Brady's control for the first few years, and the couple even launched a bid to be allowed to get married so they could visit one another. They continually wrote to each other and read the same books. But in 1972, all that changed.
I think every time she changed prison, she got hot water thrown over and people spat at her and things like that. But every time, she managed to find herself a group of friends. She established herself in prison. An awful lot of women who knew her in those days in prison really believed her when she said she had not had anything to do with these killings, which was the line she stuck to. And she separated from Brady after a little while. She cut off all contact with him.
Following conviction, they obviously went off to their separate prisons, and they maintained contact by letter and by code within the letters. So they were communicating. Obviously, these letters were censored, but they were maintaining a secret communication as well. But things over a period of the following year or two became quite frosty and really broke down altogether over a period of time.
And the coded letters, was it possible to decode them?
Yes, they were decoded at the time. One classic I can remember was him writing to her and saying, "I think it's about time you found yourself a girlfriend," and she wrote back and said, "Don't worry, I already have." So the relationship had clearly gone awry at that stage.
After losing contact with Hindley, Brady refused to cooperate with anyone in authority and showed no remorse or rehabilitation. In 1985, Brady was diagnosed as a psychopath and sectioned under the Mental Health Act. He was transferred from prison to Ashworth, a maximum security hospital.
In 1986, Winnie Johnson, the mother of Keith Bennett, wrote to Myra Hindley begging for information about her son's body. Hindley agreed to cooperate.
Former Detective Chief Superintendent Jeff Knupfer was brought in to search for the body of Keith Bennett and also the missing body of Pauline Reed.
What about her demeanour, her attitude?
She was very remorseful. She showed an awful lot of remorse. Now, We can only speculate as to whether that was genuine remorse or part of this process that they were engaged in trying to obtain her release. But she certainly tried to help. I'm in no doubt whatsoever about that she'd made a decision to help, and that's what she did.
Both Brady and Hindley were accompanied on trips to Saddleworth Moor to search for clues. Hindley made the first of 2 visits to assist the police on the 16th of December 1986. In February 1987, Myra Hindley made a formal confession to police. She admitted involvement in all 5 murders. The police in charge of the case felt they'd witnessed a great performance rather than a genuine confession. On the 1st of July 1987, Pauline Reed was discovered buried in a shallow grave on Saddleworth Moor. She was still wearing the pink and gold party dress and blue coat she'd last been seen in. Sadly, Keith Bennett's body has still not been found.
After 37 years in prison, Myra Hindley died on November the 15th, 2002, at the age of 60 at the West Suffolk Hospital in Bury St Edmunds of a serious chest infection caused by a suspected heart attack. Father Michael Teder led her funeral service. He'd been Hindley's Roman Catholic priest for the last 5 years of her life.
You know, we've all got consciences, you know, and you look back on the bad things you've done in your life.
Yes.
How did she come to terms, do you think, in her own mind with what she'd done?
I think it took a long time. I think myself, that's why she didn't confess to all of them at once. It was almost too much to her, and it was something that she worked towards over a long period of acknowledging, you know, what she'd done, of how this had affected other people, their families, how it had affected her own family and the relationships within her own family. She was very conscious that her mother was elderly, that she lived in sheltered accommodation, but she lived in fear. She was always in fear that someone on the corridor, that someone in the accommodation would know who she was and would say, "You're Myra Hindley's mother." So she realised that this was as a result of her actions. And so she was fully aware of what it had caused and the distress that it had caused to a whole range of people, but particularly the families of the children.
Ian Brady is the country's longest-serving living prisoner. In 1999, Brady went on hunger strike in an attempt to kill himself and has been force-fed every day against his will via a tube. Brady is sectioned under the Mental Health Act, so he is not allowed to take his own life. In 2013, Brady was granted a hearing in which he requested to be moved to a normal prison in Scotland. His request was denied.
My moral condemnation, my hatred of Ian Brady, frankly, knows no bounds. He is everything that is the worst in humanity. He is so manipulative, so narcissistic, so paranoid, so mentally ill on one level that, you know, you can't trust Ian Brady in any way, shape or form. But everything that he stands for are those things which I most abhor.
Ian Brady has continued to remain in the limelight since the day he was imprisoned, and he will continue to retain his platform until the day he dies. And the fact that he refuses to release any details of his crimes sort of maintains the belief there are more secrets as yet untold. He stays in regular communication with the outside world and will respond to letters. For example, this letter he sent to us when we told him we were making this programme. He's become very adept, has Ian Brady, at maintaining the myth and the mystery of the Moors murderers.
I don't think we can ever underestimate the impact of the Moors murders on the British psyche. I mean, this is an iconic set of murders. These are truly a shocking set of circumstances that captures the public's imagination in ways that I'm sure Brady intended to happen. He wanted that kind of attention. He wanted that kind of infamy, that kind of notoriety, an infamy and notoriety that he still craves.
What struck terror in the case of the Moors murders is its complete incomprehensibility. The victims were strangers to Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. There was no apparent motive for the killings. The confessions of Brady and Hindley conflict, and Myra's role in the murders will never really be known. The level of planning and cruelty in the evil case shocked the world and will forever seal Ian Brady and Myra Hindley's place as two of the most notorious killers in British criminal history.